Today we're going to be looking at the alternate history hub. Specifically, what if the Chernobyl disaster was far worse? Now that's an interesting question. Most people talk about Chernobyl being the worst thing ever in terms of nuclear and why so many people are anti-nuclear. I don't think I've ever heard someone ask, what if this thing was even worse? And the reality is, something can always be worse. It can also always be better, but we'll see. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Tyler Folse. I'm a nuclear engineer with a little over 10 years of experience in the commercial nuclear power industry. From engineering to operations to emergency response. I don't claim to know everything there is nuclear, but I can certainly share some knowledge. Let's check this out.
In 1986, the world witnessed a horror unleashed by corruption and negligence. A cascading disaster that spewed out invisible particles, contaminating everything they touched. The Chernobyl disaster released more radiation than 100 Hiroshimas, causing genetic mutations in thousands of people. I
like that he starts off talking about the corruption as the first aspect, not just nuclear in general being unsafe, because yeah, corruption played a big part of it. Bad design, bad operators. You're just asking for trouble. And it being 100 times more contaminants than Hiroshima, that's true. Even though Hiroshima killed far more people, Hiroshima was a airburst nuclear bomb. So a lot of the contaminants were just blown away from the actual blast site. And the main destructive force was the fireball and the shock waves, more so than the radiation. And Chernobyl just sat there, exposing the area to radioisotopes for days on end. So another analogy would be a nuclear bomb is a mega tsunami, and the Chernobyl accident was basically like a severe thunderstorm that just sits there for several days. The actual tonnage of water could be worse from storms that sit there for days, as I know all too well living in a place like Texas, but the overall deaths were far worse in the nuclear bombing.
Thousands died from acute radiation, thousands from various forms of cancer. Meanwhile,
thousands from various forms of cancer. So it becomes tricky attributing deaths to Chernobyl. The UN estimate is 4,000 from cancer, and it uses the very conservative linear no threshold model, which assumes that any teeny tiny bit of radiation you get would increase the risk of cancer. Now that is debatable. I'll pin a comment down below where I talk about it in far more detail, but it's a very over-conservative estimate. The official death toll is 31 quickly, and then it goes up to 50 for people after counting the acute radiation poisoning and cancers. Another thing is the 4,000 number includes some people that haven't actually died yet. It's just referring to increased probabilities from cancer regarding that over-conservative estimate. Again, you want to hear more, I'll pin a comment down below.
Already dying Soviet Union was forced to hide its scar and throw billions worth of materials to hide it. The cleanup took years and over 1 million people, and as bleak as that is, what if it was way worse?
You can only hide so much when you're setting off high radiation alarms in Scandinavia.
If the gaping pit of death was just never closed. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant was a symbol of Soviet autonomy, a marvelous wonder of science supported by its nearby town Pripyat, the 9th town of the atom. The Soviet Union was in severe decline, but the space and nuclear programs were a source of immense national pride. In 1985, a new Soviet leader rose up to this challenge.
I remember when studying the accident, Pripyat was actually a relatively nice place to live by 1980s Soviet standards anyway, at least compared to the way it was in other parts of the Soviet Union. But yeah, I hear what he's saying about it. The Soviets taking great pride in their nuclear program.
Initiated radical reforms aimed to democratize and decentralize the Soviet economy, aimed for greater transparency, began pulling troops from Afghanistan, and met with Reagan to limit nuclear weapons.
Yes, Afghanistan, the graveyard of empires.
But a year later, everything changed for Mikhail Gorbachev. Just after midnight on April 26, 1986, an inexperienced night shift crew continued a safety test that had been running all day. After stalling the reactor and making a series of mistakes, made worse by design flaws, a surge in energy output caused water to instantly vaporize. What followed was an explosion with the strength of 225 tons of TNT.
Wow, this is good that he talked about that the bigger explosion was actually steam. Now, it was steam caused by a reactivity excursion, basically the reactor going way up after, like you said, after power sagged, then power suddenly went up, and this was for a whole mess of reasons. They defeated their safety systems, which is something that would be literally impossible to do today because there are hard lockouts in modern reactors. There were operational failures, failure to adhere by their own testing procedure. So the testing procedure was dangerous enough because it called for the defeating of those safety systems. But they deviated in the non-conservative direction from said testing procedure and put the reactor in a very unstable situation. And it was a design flaw. They used graphite tip control rods. So control rods slow down the nuclear reaction. Graphite accelerates it. This RBMK reactor design uses graphite as a moderator. And what moderator means is it slows down the neutrons so they're slow enough to hit the uranium targets to cause and sustain a nuclear fission reaction. So this design was the equivalent of when you hit the brakes on your car, you actually accelerate for a split second. And given how fast nuclear reactions are, a lot can happen in a split second. And making the disaster even worse, Chernobyl did not have a true reactor containment building that could withstand the pressure and the energy from a system rupture. Because if they had a containment building that could withstand that, well, most people probably wouldn't talk about Chernobyl because no radioactive material would have ever gotten into the environment.
Which opened the reactor. Reactor 4 contained 190 tons of enriched uranium dioxide, and between 5 to 30% of it was now thrown into the open, as a massive fire began to burn all over the building. In time,
that's actually how the reactor was shut down. It was destroyed. Bits and pieces of the reactor flew everywhere so it could no longer maintain criticality. Needless to say, not the recommended way for shutting down your reactor.
Delayed Soviet response would deal with the aftermath by putting out the fire, clearing the debris, and creating a containment building around the site. But what if we were to alter this?
So it uses containment building. Engineering terms, it's more of a confinement building in that it's designed to prevent radioisotopes from escaping, like a physical border around it, the equivalent of making walls. But it's not designed to resist explosions. Both the sarcophagus and the new safe confinement building that was put up in the 2010s. Now, granted, you don't need to because the thing already exploded and there's not enough energy for it to explode again. So just one little detail.
A little bit. Unlike the ludicrous theory proposed by the HBO show, in which a thermonuclear blast blows up all 4 reactors.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate your research talking about how silly the HBO series was. Be sure to check out my reaction to that if you haven't already seen it. But thank you for pointing that out. I still hear people to this day referring to the HBO series as a documentary. It's not a documentary.
We're going to stick to something much more grounded. A scenario that we actually narrowly avoided, but would still have apocalyptic consequences. The only change I'm making here
Not sure about
is
that.
in the amount of radioactive material that was blown up. What if instead of 5 to 30%, it was somewhere around 50 to 60%? In our timeline, very few people died of acute radiation sickness, most of them
That's
firefighters. It was the initial impact and fire that did the most amount of damage and made Chernobyl a death trap. With the added radioactivity, the effects on the firefighters wearing no protective gear would be immediately apparent. 1:23 a.m. AZ-5 is pressed, and a minute later, a giant fireball blasts the roof off the reactor.
AZ-5 is the reactor trip button or reactor scram button that fully inserts all the control rods in. And this one is actually slow. It took up to 20 seconds just after that button is pressed for the rods to fall in. The reactor I worked at, We do rod drop tests all the time, and it takes 2 seconds.
Fire begins to spread, and the local firemen are called. 5 minutes later, 14 of them, present at the station, arrive at the scene. They localize the fires on the roofs of reactor 3 and 4 40 minutes later, while reinforcements were brought in from the local towns. It took another 2 hours before 250 firefighters were combating the fires at 4 a.m.
I'm still struggling to see what he means, what his definition of apocalyptic is, in that how 50 to 60% that was ejected would make things that much. I mean, yeah, it would be worse. It would make the cleanup and response worse, but not apocalyptic. But we'll see what he means by that.
It took them an hour to quench most of them, preventing the inferno from spreading to Reactor 3, which was operational the entire time. But consider this. With increased radiation, the firemen on the scene would receive lethal doses only after minutes of exposure. Severe headaches and diarrhea would occur, and the reinforcing firemen would be met with not...
So, it would have to be more than that. Unless he's referring to, like, big chunks of it all being in one spot, because, I don't know, it would have to be a very, like, neat explosion where all the radioactivity kind of falls in one area for it to be that much worse, even if you double the amount of radioactive material. Because that would really just double the dose, unless you put it all in one spot where it's a much hotter source.
A glowing fire, but a horrific scene of fallen comrades convulsing, puking, and in shock. None of them knew what they were dealing with. Nuclear reactors were under the supervision of Soviet authority, regardless where they were stationed. But the blame and the responsibility would immediately fall on the republic they were located in. In this case, the Soviet Republic of Ukraine. The firefighters would regroup and reassess the situation, doing little to stop the raging fires on the roof and turbine hall.
Yeah, it would have to be a magic explosion where everything just kind of stays. Because I guess one of the advantage would be if the debris was scattered so much, it kept the pockets of ultra high dose stuff. It was just less concentrated and people might have got less overall dose. So I'm wondering if this 50 to 60% scenario where it's further away from the core would have been less, it might have been more diffused. And I wonder if this would actually make it easier to clean up, unless maybe I'm not understanding what he means by 50 to 60%, if they just overloaded the reactor with even more fuel or something like that, which I'm struggling to see how you would do that unless you just enrich it to much higher than what would be normal for a nuclear power plant, something like 10 or 15%.
Smaller explosions would follow. The situation gets significantly worse.
So this little change right here, I guess for all intents and purposes, I'm going to assume just, okay, the dose just goes higher because of magic, and let's see how this scenario plays out.
Once the fires reach the supplies of diesel and chemicals, declassified KGB documents reveal that the government knew as early as 1983 that reactors 3 and 4 were the most dangerous ones in the Soviet Union. These papers revealed in 2021 showcased that the room housing the steam separators frequently overheated, causing the concrete to shift in its position.
They had to meet their production targets, so they were built faster, and they kind of, even like, so he mentions the steam separators, things in the secondary plant had some shoddy engineering and some rushed jobs. Not surprised.
6 a.m. the fire consumes the entire building and causes a meltdown of Reactor 3.
Would it though? I don't necessarily see how it would, because Reactor 3 never defeated their safety systems. So the fire would have to destroy, like, everything. Yeah, that's also a pretty big leap in logic there.
Fuel is added to the fire as graphite begins to act as coal, and the intense temperatures begin to melt anything in its path.
There you go. Here's your case study. Do not combine coal and nuclear power plants. There. Nah, I think we have diverged significantly from the normal timeline, and we're getting deep into silliness right now.
Structural failure. The steam rising high into the air is spread westward by the winds, forming death clouds. ready to unleash havoc in the form of radioactive rain. And so, with heavy debris thrown out in the vicinity, clouds spreading radiation northwest, a superheated core melting into the ground, and a fire that engulfed the entire building of reactors 3 and 4. How would the
Alright, so let's just say we got there. Even I disagree with his explanation of how we got there, but let's just say, yeah, the cleanup response would require a lot more, but even with that, I don't see how you're getting the lethal dose rates for the firefighters to not be able to get close, just because there's not, or at least, let me rephrase that, or at least not that much more than the actual Chernobyl accident. I mean, yes, it's going to be worse. A lot more first responders would die in this scenario, but I'm curious what he's going to say next.
The Soviet Union dealt with this crisis, as with every other in its existence, by throwing people at it. The brave liquidators, along with...
So that is actually a legitimate strategy to minimize dose. You have teams, and you tell them they can only do their job for a few seconds before switching out, so no one gets a crazy acute dose. People will get high doses, super high. Man, those would be nasty radiological work permits. But throwing people at it and minimizing the time that each individual gets it is a legitimate strategy. Never seen that incorporated throughout my career. Never dealt with stuff that was that hot. But there is a strategy that you could actually make that relatively safe.
Amounts of material managed to get things under control in our timeline, even if it was slow, inefficient, and with a great cost to human life. But in these altered conditions,
less than the alternative,
that is just not an option. Sure, dozens of helicopters can throw sand and boron at the reactor, but modern studies conclude that even in our timeline, with 5,000 tons of material thrown at the reactor, almost none of it made it into the core. That being said, they did act as
It's harder than it looks to do something like that, to drop something from a chopper.
Insulators, preventing further fires, something which in this scenario would never happen. If anything, the initial strategy, which was to have the helicopter hover directly over the smoke while they dumped their loads, would inevitably cause a crash inside the reactor building. Just imagine.
Especially if they run into a crane again.
Helicopters falling on top of the already raging reactor fire. On April 27th,
the interesting thing, though, even if vehicles do crash into it, the vehicles will shield and block some of the radioactivity for the dose, because vehicles are, just big, bulky. There's a lot of metal, a lot of steel between you and the radioactive source. That would eventually shut it down. Not the preferred method, but yeah.
1986, Pripyat and other neighboring towns were evacuated, but these 100,000 people would be far more aware of the dangers of Chernobyl. The diesel fuel explosions would be heard throughout the day. Many firemen would never return home to their families, and rumors would quickly begin to spill out. These citizens would be loaded onto buses with a 1-hour notice and kept under close supervision by the state, which would naturally want to keep information from leaking out. People were ordered to bring their documents and as much food as they could carry, since they would return in 3 days. A timer which, when expired, would escalate the panic even further. Soviet invincibility was to remain unquestioned, and the head of the Ukrainian...
Now this part of this alternate timeline, I would not be surprised if this was the case, just continuing the spin.
Volodymyr Shebitsky firmly believed in nuclear energy. As with much in this disaster, the man was the worst possible candidate to lead Ukraine at this critical juncture. A conservative who hated Gorbachev's radical policies, a neo-Stalinist who did everything he could to Russify Ukraine. He went ahead with the planned May Day parade, even taking his grandchild to the celebration, while being fully aware of the danger. May 1st was like the 4th of July for the Soviet Union, so this was just a recipe for disaster.
I don't know about that. I mean,
on that day, the fire, which had been burning for quite some time, would create particles that easily traveled the 60 miles from Chernobyl to Kiev. Those particles would deposit...
Now that entirely depends on which direction the wind's blowing. Because it can be quite... If the wind's blowing the other way, they might actually be alright. It's just... In this alternate timeline, did it affect the weather patterns to blow it to Kiev? Let's see.
themselves in the lungs, skin, clothes, and bright red banners of the unsuspecting 2.5 million people. By this point, those same particles would be detected by the Swedish as well as NASA spy satellites. The gaping pit at Chernobyl would spread its poison from far beyond the Iron Curtain, raising many questions that the heads of state were unwilling to answer.
I'm just wondering what things, so let's just say all 4 units melted down in Chernobyl and they all exploded like the original one. I mean, here, which again, not likely considering they weren't doing said special test and their safety systems would be intact, even if the adjacent buildings was destroyed. Now, granted, they're not as well protected as, say, the nuclear plant that I worked at, or any other nuclear power plant for that matter, but quadrupling, even octupling it, so let's do the 50 to 60% for times 4, that's going to make it a lot worse, but I just don't see how we get there, unless, like he was saying, we're dealing with magic radiation that, like, instantly kills the firefighters, like he was saying, because unlike what actually happened, because even doubling the density is not going to do that.
As seen in the HBO show, there was a real fear of the reactor fuel melting into the water bubbler beneath, which contained a lot of water and thus would lead to a thermal explosion when the hot material vaporized it.
Sure.
However, this is one instance of Hollywood drama. In reality, this had already happened, and it didn't cause a substantial explosion. Even if it did, it would be about 200 times less powerful than the initial blast. However, considering the dramatically worse circumstances in the area, the miners are never sent to build a concrete pad underneath the reactor. What that means is that a significant amount of radioactive material does make it into the groundwater. Chernobyl is only a few miles away from the Pripyat River, which flows into the Dnieper, the 4th largest river in Europe, flowing downstream to dense population centers like Kiev and Kherson. Fishing, livestock, and agriculture would be severely affected. And when you add on top of that the rain that would affect the nearby area, we're talking about a severe famine. At the time, the Soviet Union was struggling to meet demands for food supply and was forced to import a vast amount of grain.
So we're diverting pretty far here. Yep, contamination gets in the groundwater just like anything else contaminated. What you would do in that case, you'd measure it, find out the extent of the contamination. Could be as simple as pumping it out, using demineralizers and ion exchangers, filtration, reverse osmosis, dilution, really the same way you would treat any sort of contaminants in water, though you would need many stages of this if this contamination is as severe as he's talking about.
From outside places, including the US, as demonstrated by the 1973 wheat deal. Ukraine was its breadbasket, one which the state was known to exploit severely in the past. This was mostly due to how well irrigated the region was by said river, and because of the abundance of black soil, or Chernobyl. This soil was an agricultural gold mine, and now anything grown on it would very likely be contaminated. Thousands of cattle would have to be put—
Man, that would take a lot. It would take a lot to contaminate a river that's that big, even if you didn't treat it. We're dealing with magical amounts of radiation here, so anything is possible.
The fishing industry would turn belly up, and agricultural products would be tossed aside. The Soviet people would have to choose whether to starve or to eat poison.
Really?
The first horseman of the apocalypse would by this point be very apparent, as tens of thousands of people begin to show signs of radiation sickness. But the second horseman, famine, would really shake things up. In our timeline, rumors and myths around
this is getting silly, by the way,
and people who decontaminated the site led to abortion rates skyrocketing and avoidance of everyone who was near Chernobyl.
Now that was based on perceived risk versus actual risk, the increase in terminated pregnancies. Very, very sad.
Were scientifically accurate, and yet it persisted in the national and even international consciousness.
So, in this scenario, the one thing that he's right about is the fear of nuclear would be even crazier than it is now. People would think it's apocalyptic. There are people that still think the real Chernobyl was apocalyptic, even though it wasn't.
For decades, radiation doesn't spread like an infection, But
Thank
with
you for
how
saying
bad
that.
things are in this scenario, that's exactly how people would treat it. Any person,
Sure.
food, or water source that even had the possibility of being in range of the accident.
Then again, I'm not actually sure because a lot of people didn't take COVID very seriously, so I don't know.
Would be avoided at all costs. Those children celebrating the May Day parade would fall ill. Their quick metabolism absorbing radioactive iodine, which would cause pounding headaches and thyroid cancer at unprecedented rates.
So dose equivalent iodine is the main conversion. It's like the conversion unit of measure. So like measuring the strength of nuclear bombs in terms of Hiroshima's, for instance, a bit of a weird unit, but that's one way off-site dose is measured for emergency planning and for technical specifications, because that one would have that most immediate effect in the large early release type scenario. Not to say people wouldn't get contaminated with other radioisotopes, it's just a conversion bulk unit of measure. It's not the most accurate, but it just gives you a quick general sense number.
Sending their parents into a frenzy. Remember the apocalyptic feeling of those first few months of COVID, and then dial that
bring
up
up
to
COVID.
11.
Yep.
There is a pretty good chance people start drinking bleach as a way of fighting radiation. Add to that an untrustworthy,
If you do that, the radiation won't kill you.
severely shaken government, and you have a recipe for disaster. Firstly, the countries most affected by the fallout would blame the centralized government for its incompetence and demand answers. There's a possibility that Ukraine's 50
The Soviet guys saying, I don't know, I mean, regular Chernobyl, that's possible, but considering this involved magic and other things, then I'm not sure how we got there.
and Belarus's 10 would be the first to
I like these
try to
little
break
icons
off
that
in
he
a
uses.
violent manner, with some of the conservatives using this as an opportunity to turn against Gorbachev and his radical policies which hadn't even kicked in yet. Those orders
Okay, you could tell he's being silly.
both in putting
I
out
wouldn't
the
take this
fire
seriously.
and rebellion, might just disobey or directly oppose the bureaucracy. By the end of May, the last of the fires would have burnt out, which meant that they would burn for about 5 extra weeks longer than in our timeline, with much greater intensity. There was a
You set
way
off
for these
diesel fuels,
particles
sure.
to be dealt with, however, as both NATO and the Soviets would mobilize pilots and artillery armed with silver iodine munitions. This would turn the radioactive clouds into rain, preventing it from reaching dense urban.
I was gonna say, set off explosions to starve it of oxygen. Shoot missiles and artillery shells at it. And hey, the shell fragments could even absorb some of that radiation. This is getting pretty silly.
Areas. In our timeline, this actually occurred, and the Soviets sacrificed half of Belarus to save Moscow.
I'm waiting for when he says they call in a nuclear strike on this. Now, you'd think that would be crazy, but considering magical levels of dose, even a direct hit with a nuclear weapon would be less dose than this crazy scenario he's talking about. So, nuking the nuclear disaster. Silly. Wouldn't recommend it, but considering how silly this is, I can see that being brought up.
In this scenario, the effects would be so much worse. Not all clouds would be intercepted, and the prolonged fire would spread particles east and south, as well as northwest. Upon meeting the mountains, heavy rain would pour all over the Alps, Caucasus, and Balkans, contaminating even more people, turning this local disaster into a regional one. Supply lines and infrastructure would break down, and each republic would be left to fend for itself. The Afghanistan withdrawal would become totally disorganized, and the Mujahideen would regain power by the end of 1986. These troops would be needed for what would happen next. In our world, the Soviet
It's not going to spread all the way to Afghanistan, this scenario.
collapsed in 1991, largely due to Gorbachev's policies, but even in 1986, the cracks were showing. The Baltics and Caucasus were on the brink, and due to their location, the severe consequences they would endure as a result of Soviet mismanagement would stoke the flame and start a revolution. Poland, Uzbekistan, and Moldova would quickly be added to the list.
Maybe he's just...
States within the
I think he's just making an apocalypse for like early Soviet dissolution or something.
Soviet influence.
Maybe that's the reason for this video.
Bulgaria would completely withdraw from the Warsaw Pact. All of this would happen in the backdrop of the 1986 war in Ukraine and Belarus, the key republics that were the first to oppose Gorbachev. Rather than being a two-sided conflict, this would be an amalgamation of loyalists versus conservatives versus nationalist movements.
Like that they two look the same, the loyalists and the conservatives.
Versus people who just wanted to avoid the effects of radiation, with some level of NATO meddling on top of all of that.
Of course.
Ooh. And while all of this was happening, there was nothing being done against the effect of radiation, which was far too deep behind the curtain for international aid. The Soviet government would be in free fall, and it could be more than likely that the young and
I mean, that's one of the reasons why some of the response in the actual Chernobyl accident took as long as it did, was because of it was behind the curtain and list foreign aid that would happen in, I don't know, any global coalition to combat the disaster.
Gorbachev
Talking
would be
in real life,
assassinated
not
by a
silliness.
rival party or some random protest. Unlike in our timeline, the Soviet collapse would be violent, with autonomous republics breaking out and forming their own governments in Asia, hundreds of thousands of people fleeing from the crisis, along with vast amounts of Cold War weapons being used in factional wars. The West would be victorious.
It's causing a butterfly effect.
But this apocalypse would not leave it untouched. Mass hysteria and a refugee crisis of unthinkable proportions would cause the Reagan and Thatcher governments to make...
Is everyone going to shut off the nuclear plants in this timeline now?
The price of grain and other goods would skyrocket. If you look at the regions closest to Chernobyl and categorize them in tiers based on how badly they would suffer from the fallout, we're talking about 100 million people in the immediate surrounding area, half of them Russians, and the other half Ukrainians and Belarusians. And then we have another 60 million Russians, 20 million in the Caucasus and Baltics, 20 million Germans, 20 million Romanians, and almost 40 million Poles. Then we finally have Austria.
This might as well be like an alien invasion type attack or something like that, which I know he has covered on this channel, so I think maybe this is clearly done just for fun.
Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Turkey, and the people in Scandinavia, all of which make up nearly 100 million people. In total, the regions who would be devastated by the effects of radiation, famine,
everywhere
would encompass a population of roughly 367.7 million people.
Here we go.
The amount of people who would perish due to the effects of radiation itself would be far smaller than even a single %. But the way humans work, the psychological effects and geopolitical
people are going to think a billion people died.
Redraw the map and cause the worst crisis in Europe since the Black Death. For those who remain, fertility rates would severely drop, while child deformities and cancer rates would be catastrophic. An area the size of Texas would be left almost...
Now, is he talking about what actually would happen, or was he talking about what people think? If he's talking about what people feared, I'd buy that, but what would actually happen, no.
Completely depopulated, reclaimed by nature with a sprawling and slightly mutated wildlife, and maybe people, those who choose to remain.
Oh, here we go.
A strict
crazy video game
policy would be put in place, and an international mission would be launched years after the disaster. There would be a lot of efforts by the scientific community to stop the bleeding of this radioactive wound. Today, about 10% of the world's energy is nuclear, which is twice of that produced by wind and solar combined. But in this world, nuclear energy would become a taboo, a horror story.
It already is for some people.
Refugees would resettle in different regions and mix with local populations. The economy would slowly recover. The only Russian and Ukrainian people left would be either abroad or living in dystopian bunker societies. That's
pretty silly. No, I don't think this would happen by merely doubling the amount of radioactive concentration. No, that would make it more... I don't even think that would make it twice as worse, just because it would be more diffuse and spread everywhere. But let's be conservative and maybe say it'll be twice as worse. But this whole cascade of unfortunate events, even if all 4 units melted down, we're not talking this crazy levels. I mean, other than maybe the hysteria portion, but even that, I just don't know. But I could tell he did this as an exercise, just to be goofy with a bunch of little characters. One thing I do like about this video is he did point out several of the misconceptions in the Chernobyl series. Again, if you want to hear a deep dive on that, I'll pin it down in the comments below. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time.